Welcome to our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. You are in the series of videos talking about the research process, and our first episode we introduced the what's research and the research process. We went through several episodes, and now we are in the 6 episodes that will be talking about writing a quantitative purpose statement. In the last episode, we talked about purpose statements that includes the objectives and how we can write the specific objectives, etc. But now we will narrow our focus to writing quantitative purpose statements, and by doing so, we will first talk about variables, because speaking of quantitative research, we can't leave out variables. So the first part will be explaining what are variables and different categories of variables and the families of variables, so that we can build up on how we can write quantitative purpose statements in research study. So what's is a variable? As an introduction here, we say when you are writing quantitative purpose statements, or you are writing research questions, or you are writing hypothesis, you need to understand the variables. And what's a variable? Variable actually is a characteristic, or it's an attribute of an individual. It's a characteristic or an attribute of an individual or an organization that a researcher can measure, and it can vary among individuals, or it can vary among organizations that are studied. Speaking of characteristics, they reflect, or they refer to personal aspects about individuals. For example, a grade level of individual, for example, age of an individual, or an income level of an individual. And when we are talking about attributes, they represent how an individual or individuals in organizations, or in wherever they feel, how they behave, or they think. So things like individual self-esteem, or individuals involved in certain activities, let's say individuals smoking, or so the difference between characteristics and the attributes is that the characteristics, they refer to the person aspects, and the attributes, they represent the feeling or the behavior or the thinking of individuals. And speaking of measurements, this means the researchers record information from individuals in one or two ways. These variables are the key ideas that researchers seek to collect information on to address certain purpose of their study. So let's talk about measurement of variables. As we have said, that measurement means researchers record information from individuals, and they record such information in two ways. One is through asking them a number of questions on a questionnaire, and the individual answers. Then the researcher takes those questions as a record. Then another way is through observation, where the researcher observes an individual and records scores in a checklist or a logbook. So those are the two ways of which a researcher makes measurements of variable. But in either cases, either you are asking questions on a questionnaire, or you are observing, then those answers or those scores given by individuals will vary, and in that case the name variable comes along. So the name variable comes because the scores, or the answers that we get from the individuals, they vary. One individual may answer this question, may answer this, and another one may answer another answer. For example, you asking about the sex of an individual, one individual may say he is a male, and another one would say a female. So simply because the answers or the scores vary, then that is the name variable comes. So variables can be distinguished as categories or continuous. We can have categorical variables or continuous variables. It depends. These categorical variables are measured by researcher as a small number of groups. If you have a kind of answers that you can put them in form of groups, for example, speaking of sex, speaking of gender, the answers are obtained through groups. For example, the class can be first class, second class, third class. There are some groups, and these groups and these categorical variables can be subdivided into either you are talking of just nominal variables. We call them nominal simply because they just give names or whatever, and some ordinal variables simply because they follow a kind of order. For example, if you have a kind of ordering starting from low to upper, then such kind of categorical variable will be called the ordinal variable. But other variables that they do not follow an order, they are called the nominal variables, simply because they have categories. But we can have another group of variables that we call continuous variables. These are measured by researchers on a point along a certain continuum, from low to high. For example, speaking of age, speaking of height, speaking of any numerical values that we obtained from an individual while we are measuring such scores from him. So continuous variables can be ratios or can be intervals. So those are the categories or the distinguishing between categorical and the continuous variables. But variables have families. They are about 4 families of variables, but the main 2 are the most important. One, we have dependent variables and we have independent variables. Speaking of dependent variables, these are the attributes or the characteristics that are dependent or they are influenced by another variable that is called the independent variable. So they are the ones that are influenced and or they are affected or they are dependent on another variable. You might find them in the literatures, we call them outcome. For example, if you have a study that looks for an outcome or the effect or the criteria or the sequence of doing something, then you are dealing with the dependent variables. To locate these dependent variables, you just look or examine in the purpose statement or research questions or hypothesis. If you find some explanation talking about effects, some explanation talking about outcome, criteria or consequences, then just note that you are dealing with the dependent variables. And we have what we call independent variables. Speaking of independent variables, they are attributes or characteristics that influence or affects those upper variables that we call the dependent variables. So these 2 variables, one depends on another and another one in fact affects or influences another, that is affects or influences an outcome. In research studies, you will find things like factors. If you are talking about you want to find factors affecting something, or treatments or predictors or determinants or antecedents, if you find these kinds of words, then you just note that you are dealing with the independent variables. So those are the 2 important families of variables, but we have other families of variables. For example, we have what we call control variables. Speaking of control variables, these are the part or they are the types of independent variables. So they are part and parcel of independent variables, but researchers measure these for the purpose of eliminating it as possibility. It is not a central variable of concern in explaining the dependent variable or an outcome. You have variables that are not the main variables that can affect the outcome, but you just need to measure them. And most of these variables they are personal demographic attributes or characteristics. For example, you find gender, intelligence, socioeconomic status, etc. For example, you are in a study that you want to find the effect of certain independent variables to a certain outcome, but you want to control some other variables not to be included in the effect or in the outcome that you want to measure. So if you exclude such variables, then you say those are called the control variables. And we have another type of variables that we call treatment variables. These are measured in categories. They either received or denied activities. You can group variables, your participants in two groups, and you decide to give them certain activities or to deny them certain activities, so that you can determine an outcome, on a certain outcome. You will find these variables named as manipulated variables. You manipulate them, either you decide to allow certain activities to be received, or you deny them certain activities. We call them treatment variables, and these normally are used while you are dealing with the design, which is called experimental design. You manipulate certain variables so that you can see the outcome or the effect, or you just decide to not give anything to these variables, so that you can see what effects will be obtained from that. So that's another family. Now let's move to writing, how we can write quantitative research questions, how we can write quantitative research questions. Because research questions narrow and focus the purpose statement, they serve to restate the purpose statement in specific questions that researchers seek to answer. You have a research, a purpose statement that gives you an intent, what the researcher wants to do. But what the researcher wants to do, then it can be broken down, can be narrowed into some specific questions, that these specific questions in their totality can result into answers that will provide, or will give that intent of the researcher. So research questions describe the participants' reaction to a single variable, or they can compare group on an outcome, or they can relate variables. So these three important things, you either describe the reaction of a single variable. For example, you are just asking how frequently a certain person uses internet. That's the reaction of a participant can be 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day. So it's just a single variable. Or you can compare groups of variables. You can compare groups of variables. Or sometimes you can relate these variables, how one variable relates to another variables. So research questions are found in all quantitative research. For example, you have experiments, you have correlations studies, or you have survey studies. You can find what we call the research questions. Now let's see the guidelines. Let's see the guidelines for writing research questions. How do you write research questions? There are some basic steps. There are some basic steps that should be followed while you are writing research questions. There are some basic questions that should be followed while you are writing some basic questions. The first step, you have to pose a question. Just ask a question. Just pose a question. But the question for quantitative research questions should begin with the how. It should begin with the words such as how, should begin with the words such as what, should begin with the words such as why. So those are the important words that should begin while you are writing research questions in quantitative. Then you should specify the independent, dependent, and mediating or control variables. So you should be clear of these variables, whether they are independent variables, or they are dependent or independent, or mediating variables, or mediating variables. Now use the words such as describe, compare, or relate to indicate the action or connection among those variables. So if you want to describe, that means you are dealing with just a single variable, and if you compare, means you are dealing with the two or more groups. And if you are dealing with if you want to relate, means you have two or more two or more variables that you find their relationship. Now you also have to indicate the participants and the research site for the study. As you are explaining, as you are writing your research questions, you should include these important things. You have to include the research site, you have to indicate the participants, and you have to state the research site. You have to state the research site. Now, after that, we have a popular forms of which we can write the quantitative research questions. There are some popular forms that we can use to write research questions. There are three important popular forms. One form is descriptive questions. One form is, we call it descriptive questions. Speaking of descriptive questions, these are research questions that use they identify participants' response to a single variable or a single question. So for example, you can ask a question like, how frequent do we put the participant name? As in the guideline there, we said in the guideline back here, we said we have to indicate the participants and the research site for the study. So as we are writing the descriptive questions, we follow this kind of formula. For example, we are asking, how frequent do you put the participant name, you put the variable, and the research site. For example, you could have a question like this. For example, you can ask a question, how frequently do students use internet on a college? As you can see there, how frequently do, we say students are the participants, and use of internet is the variable. On the college campus, that is the research site. As you can see, it has followed those rules if you are dealing with the descriptive questions. And there, if the answer for that frequent question will result into some descriptive analysis, there you will measure the things like modes, that the median, the mean, etc. Those they fall under descriptive analysis. Another popular form of quantitative research question is relation question. This seek to answer the degree and magnitude of relationship between two or more variables, and it follows the following formula. For example, you can ask, how does you put an independent variable related to dependent variable for participants at research site? As we have said in the guideline, I told you in the guideline that we have to include the variables, you have to include the participants, and you have to include the research site. For example, you can have a question like this. The question of internet that we have shown in the descriptive questions can be, how does internet relate to performance of student at the college? You hear that? How does internet, so the internet use, or internet, how does use of internet, that is independent variable, relate to performance? That performance will be dependent. That means performance depends on the use of internet. And of student are the participants at the college, then that is the research site. As you can see, we have followed the guideline rule. Now we have another type of questions. We call them a comparison questions. Comparison questions, these may be asked to find out how two or more groups of an independent variable differ in terms of one or more outcome variables. As you can see, say we have two or more groups. We just want to compare the independent variables of these groups, how they differ in terms of their outcome the variables. So in most of the time, experiments employ this kind of questions. You compare two or more groups. As you remember, during experiments, what we do, we have two groups. The group that we call it control group, and we have another group that is called the experimental group. So in the end, we need to compare how the independent variables in these groups the independent variables in these groups, they differ in terms of their outcome. For example, this group will result into a certain outcome and another group will result into a certain outcome. So the general formula for writing a comparison questions would be like, how does group 1 differ from group 2 in terms of dependent variable for participants at the research site? Let me give you a real example. For example, you have two groups. One group, you put them as on-campus students, and another group you put them as off-campus students. So you can write something like this: how do on-campus students and off-campus students compare in terms of use of internet at the college? So you see, group 1 would be on-campus student, group 2 would be off-campus student, and a dependent variable there, we have the use of internet at the college. So you see, that is how we write what we call a comparison questions. Moving forward now, let's see how we can write a quantitative hypothesis. Similar to what we have done in research questions, hypotheses also narrow the purpose statement in quantitative research. But these hypotheses, what they do is they do a kind of prediction about what the researcher expects to find. The researcher gets or finds the results from the past studies, past literature, and suggest certain outcomes as a prediction to the current study. So hypotheses are not used to describe a single variable. You cannot, as we have done in research questions, we had descriptive research questions that they describe a single variable. This does not happen with the hypothesis. There must be either you want to find a relationship or you want to compare, but not description of a single variable. So hypotheses are not used to describe a single variable, as found in the case of those research questions. And we have a guideline for writing a quantitative hypothesis. We have a guideline for writing quantitative hypothesis. The first thing it says that you have to state the variable in the order of either you are speaking of independent. Independent variable should appear as the first position, followed by dependent variable and a control variable. And if you compare groups in your hypothesis, explicitly state the groups. If variables are related, specify the relationship among the variables, as we have seen with the research questions back then. Make a prediction about changes you expect in your group, such as less or more favorable, or no change, no difference. You will test this prediction using statistical procedures. We will see this as we go on with the examples. So we have two important types of hypothesis. We have null and alternative hypothesis. You need both of these, null and hypothesis, in your research study, but most researchers do use only one among these. So in this explanation, I will focus much on the null hypothesis. But null hypothesis, what they do, they make predictions that all possible people whom researcher might study, all possible people, we call them a general population. There is no relationship between independent and dependent variables, or no difference between groups of an independent and dependent variables. So you have your general population, and you try first to say or to predict that there is no relationship between the independent and dependent variables in your general population, or there is no difference between dependent and independent variables in your general population. So to start this hypothesis, you will deselect a sample of all possible people and draw conclusion from the statistical analysis. So you have your general population, and from the general population, you just take a small sample of it, then you test it to see whether it is true that there is no relationship, or whether it is true that there is no difference between independent and dependent variables. So Null hypothesis might begin with the phrases like this. You can find such phrases like there is no difference between groups, or there is no relationship among or between groups or variables, etc. For example, take this kind of formula. It says there is no difference between independent variable of group 1 and independent variable of group 2 in terms of dependent variable for participants at a research site. For example, let me give you this kind of hypothesis. For example, you could say there is no difference between off-campus and on-campus in terms of students' achievement on programming performance for first year student in a college. So you see up the first group is of campus student, and the second group is on campus students, and here the independent variable is, we are talking about their achievement when programming performance, and we talk about the participants. The participants are the first year students at a research site, which is the college. So that is how you can write your hypotheses. You can write your hypothesis in your research process. So this is the sixth episode. We'll move on to the seventh episode that will cover literature review. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video to other people so that they can also get knowledge about how they can do proper research. So see you in the next episode, which will be explaining about literature review. Thank you very much. This is Agustino Mogosi on the Elimika Mtandaoni.